is now called to order.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Roll call, please.
Councilmember Cooper?
Here.
Councilmember Beaton? Here. Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Here.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Here.
Mayor Smith?
Here.
Councilmember Whitliff?
Here.
Councilmember Pontiac? Here. City Manager?
Here.
City Attorney?
Here.
DPW Director? Here. Finance Director? Here.
Yep.
Here. Public Safety Director?
On public hearings, we have none. Citizen comments on agenda-related items. Is there any citizens that wish to make comment on agenda-related items? Please come forward, state your name and address. You'll be afforded 5 minutes for comment. Yes.
Bob Grabowski, 4th Street, Manistee. On letter D on the agenda, I don't think Tom Roden should be entitled to information in people's private affairs from year 2014. If anything, he should take from the morning it happened, if council and police go along with it, take the report from them, not prying into somebody's personal life in 3 years prior. I would say to deny that appeal. Thank you.
Are there any other citizen comments?
No.
If not, we'll move on to the consent agenda.
Mr. Mayor, under the consent agenda, I'd like to have item 9B, consideration of Manistee County Homeward Bound Animal Shelter Annual Strut Your Mutt event, taken up later on and discussed at the meeting.
All items marked with an asterisk on the consent agenda are considered by the city manager to be routine matters. Prior to approval of the consent agenda, any member of council may have an item from the consent agenda removed and taken up during the regular portion of the meeting. Consent agenda items include approval of minutes, payroll, invoices, notification regarding next work session. And we will remove, per request of Councilmember Cooper, consideration of Manistee County Homeward Bound Animal Shelter Stretcher Mutt event through the regular agenda. At this time, council could take action to approve the consent agenda.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Goodspeed, second by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski. Is there any discussion? Would you please take roll?
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Yes.
Councilmember Whitliff?
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac?
Yes.
Mayor Smith?
Yes. Thank you. Unfinished business, we have none. New business. Consideration of local revenue sharing board grant applications. Local Revenue Sharing Board distributes 2% from the Little River Casino. Deadline for the 2017 Cycle 2 applications is Friday, September 1st, 2017 at 5 p.m. City staff has prepared 2 grant applications for submission to the Local Revenue Sharing Board. This agenda item will include 2 separate motions, one for each grant applications. At this time, council could take action to authorize the submission of a grant application to the Local Revenue Sharing Board for a public safety utility vehicle in the amount of $25,409.12.
I'll make it.
I'll second.
I have a motion by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, a second by Councilmember Goodspeed. Is there any discussion on this item?
Yes. I don't know, I don't quite understand the reason for purchasing this vehicle. We already have a vehicle that we use for the beaches. So I'd like somebody to explain why we need to buy another one.
Public Safety Director Coles will speak to that.
Evening.
It's a very valid point. The vehicle that we have right now is a 10-year-old vehicle, and it's very tired, and the amount of cost that we're putting into it, amount of expenditure to try to keep that thing running is really outweighing the purchase of a new one. We've lost our four-wheel drive and forward, which is going to be an expense to try to get that repaired. We also noticed, especially on our last call with that issue on the 5th Avenue beach, that with only having 2 doors, 2 people that can sit in it with 2 medics and trying to get all the equipment, that we thought it'd be beneficial to have 4 doors, which we do need an improvement on it. So the biggest thing is the years that we've expended on that vehicle and the need to upgrade.
Thank you.
Any further questions? City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Councilmember Beaton?
No.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac?
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper?
Yes.
Mayor Smith?
Yes.
Councilmember Whitliff?
Yes.
And Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. At this time, council could take action to authorize the submission of a grant application to the Local Revenue Sharing Board for 2 Vindicator nozzles in the amount of $1,804.90.
I'll make the motion.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Goodspeed, second by Councilmember Whitliff. Is there any discussion? City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton?
Yes.
Councilmember Whitliff?
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac?
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper?
Yes.
And Mayor Smith?
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. Consideration of authorizing a notice of intent for the issuance of water and sewer revenue bonds in one or more series and the principal amount not to exceed $25 million. The most recent Michigan Department of Environmental Quality NPDES permit effective January 1, 2017 includes a final wet weather corrective action plan to eliminate the last combined sewer overflow. This is the culmination of a 20-year sewer separation process. The project and the MDEQ requirement have been discussed with council and community several times over the last few years. Notice of intent resolution is the first step in issuing these bonds. At this time, council could take action to adopt a notice of intent resolution for the issuance of water and sewer revenue bonds in one or more series.
Mayor, staff has some information that we would like to present to council on this topic.
Okay.
Council, Mayor Smith, the first item we're going to show is a short video clip from the meeting that we didn't have a quorum, where Bond Counsel Pat McGowan and City Engineer Sean Middleton talk a little bit about the issue, and then we have a PowerPoint presentation that Jeff and Sean and myself will be presenting after that. So we'll go ahead and play this, and then we'll do the presentation.
I'm not there.
Nope. I am.
With the bond.
Thank you. Pat, you want to make a few comments about what the process is and notice of intent?
Sure, great.
Nice
Thank you.
and
Good evening. For those that don't know me, my name is Pat McGowan. I'm an attorney. I've worked with the city on their financing projects for a number of years, both buildings as well as water and sewer issues. So I know that you've been discussing for a while now the wet weather corrective action program, which is being required of the city to essentially this final step in a multi-year, multi-decade process dealing with some of the CSO issues. And the city has had a lot of discussions with the DEQ and what you need to do in order to get your next discharge permit. And right now, the project itself isn't exactly clear what is required, but what is clear is there needs to be a significant amount of investigation as phase one, and then figure out what's needed for phase two. So in order to pay for that, the city has looked at a variety of options and has several different options, including funding through the U.S. Federal government through the Rural Development Office. Rural Development offers 40-year loans at low interest rates to small communities for water and sewer projects, and the city is eligible for financing through them. When any of these projects go for financing, whether it's a loan through the rural development, whether it's a bond that's sold in the open market, or a bond that goes through the state revolving fund, all of which are options that the city has pursued in one way or another in the past, it requires the city to go through a process to issue a bond, which is essentially memorializing your obligation to pay back the loan. So whether we go to rural development, an open market bond, or the state SRF, the city has to go through the same steps it would legally in order to issue a bond payable from the rates and charges to the water and sewer system customers, and go through that process regardless of where the funding's going to come from. In order to issue bonds, it's really a multi-step process. The first step, once you have identified the project amount, is to adopt a notice of intent resolution which indicates the intent to issue bonds. This authorizes the publication of a notice in the newspaper that informs the citizens that the city intends to issue bonds at an amount not to exceed X dollars. And then that allows the voters, if they want to submit referendum petitions to require an election on the bond issue. An election is not required unless a petition is filed within 45 days. Once that procedure is done, then really it's a matter of getting the project pulled together and coming back for a later meeting of the city council to actually authorize a bond. So what we were looking to do tonight was that first step in the process, which was the approval of a notice of intent resolution, which would be the first step of a multi-step process to issue the bonds. The way that that's been worded, because we don't know exactly the size or scope of the improvements, but yet wanting to make sure it incorporated the range of possibilities, was written rather broadly to allow for the issuance of bonds up to $25 million, which I know is the big number on what it could be depending on what's found, in one or more series, and for a period of up to 40 years. That's really designed to give the city the most flexibility on the financing. That would allow you to do a rural development loan, an open market bond issue, and really any amount up to that amount that's needed based on whatever the engineers find with the investigative phase. As you know, there's a rather tight timetable that's been imposed on the city to have this investigatory work done within the next 12 months, so that the plan is in place to figure out what's needed for the actual improvements. So essentially the plan that we've talked about is really to, if approved by the city, would be to have the first financing be a small bond issue to cover the investigatory work that would be done relatively soon to allow the engineers to do all the scoping and the investigations that's needed, and then come back to the city once there's a plan for you to decide what actual work would be done, and then there would be a second phase, which would be that financing. So that's essentially what's incorporated into this action item, which is really to give the city the flexibility and the direction to move forward with a financing, first the investigation, and then later the actual work for the construction. But again, in either case, the notice of intent resolution by itself doesn't obligate the city to do anything. It doesn't mandate that you go ahead with bonds on any timetable. It really is the first step in what is a multi-step process that then allows you later to decide how much is going to be issued and how, and that would have to come back to the council for approval before any debt was actually authorized. So that's kind of it in a nutshell in terms of what the action item was that was before you tonight. I'd be happy to answer any specific questions about the financing options, the resolution, or the bond process in general. And as you know, Sean is here to talk, if you want to, about the corrective action plan and that timetable as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
John, if you could come forward for a moment, please. And with all the work that's been done thus far under the SAW grant and all the televising and flow monitoring and all that, how much investigative work do we still have to go before we actually can formulate a plan for corrective action?
So the SAW grant, it was set up to inventory and condition assess the system. We've done, on the sanitary side, we've done about 2/3 of the system, televising. And that assessment is just for the condition of it. So it's a structural assessment. So when they do the televising, they come back and they tell us whether the pipe's, good, fair, or poor, and that's whether it's remaining service life on it. What the SAW grant did not do at all was fund looking for infiltration and inflow. Now, we see that as part of it, as kind of a side benefit we're getting, we're knowing a lot about the system, but the corrective action plan that the MDEQ has imposed upon us is where they really want us to look for where is your inflow and infiltration sources, quantify them, look at how you can eliminate them, and then balance that against storing that water or, getting rid of it, somehow putting it in a storm sewer. So there's a condition on one side with the SAW, and then there's this whole analysis for inflow and infiltration that we need to do as part of the corrective action program. We're gonna leverage in all the SAW work, but there's still a third of the city to televise. We'll be doing smoke testing, a lot of field work with dye testing, going manhole to manhole, trying to figure out where things are connected. And that's laid out, and we've presented it before, but it's laid out in that very detailed corrective action plan we wrote up for the DEQ. And it's probably 4 or 5 pages long, outlining every step they're requiring us to go through. So I'd like to say the SAW grant would take care of that, but it really is got a different purpose.
That wasn't the intent.
Right.
Do we have some pretty good ideas of what we're looking at, or is it still pretty vague?
The things we know today are the CSO, good or bad, is a good measuring stick as to what could be expected for sizing a basin, for example. So we've had, since we started detailed monitoring with our measuring devices in place, we've had 22 events, and they've been anywhere from a couple 100,000 gallons up to 12 million gallons. And the DEQ has some requirements in terms of size of storms you use to size the basin. So looking at that and kind of interpolating some things, we know we could be 3 to 6 million gallons in storage if we do not find anything else in the system. We can't eliminate an inflow source. If there's a big parking lot someplace we find that's tied in, we get rid of it, that could save, 200, 300,000 gallons, and that's dollars saved towards storage. So we have ideas just from the CSO monitoring. We have ideas where the really poor pipe in the system is that's very leaky. We can see that in the televising data, but we'll need to quantify that and figure out where some of these surface water sources are. Those are the ones that really cause the CSOs.
I know we're putting the cart before the horse right now with this question. Can't we, other communities have put like a tube or balloon and then like sealed around the pipes, you know what I mean, made like an inner liner?
Mhm.
What's the chance of that ever happening with us?
Very likely it actually will happen. I'm almost certain of it. It's, they call it in-place lining or cured in-place lining, and they put a sock inside the pipe and they put water in it, heat it up, and then it cures in place. Essence gives you another 50, 75, 100 years of life out of that pipe. And that seals infiltration off, and we will absolutely be doing that. And that's one of the methods we'll need to balance against, putting that in for so many dollars a foot versus storing that water at a big basin next to the wastewater treatment plant. And so we're gonna have to go through a whole analysis where some pipes are really leaky or they have inflow, and it's very cost effective to line them and get rid of it, where other ones might not be that bad and they're kind of marginal, where it's almost better just to let that go down to the plant and then store it and treat it. And that's a whole process we'll have to do, is to balance those methods kind of out in the system versus collecting it at the end of the pipe.
Okay. Yeah. I know they say it's unbelievable cheaper or less expensive than obviously tearing the whole.
Right, that's the whole issue, is you don't have to rebuild a road. There's some places we might want to rebuild a road, but that's the savings, is it's done all below grade, and now with a lot of impact to the roads and streets and other utilities.
Any other question? All right, thank you, sir.
Good evening. We've given many of these presentations to City Council. We took this PowerPoint from the June 2016 meeting where we presented information to Council, and I'm just going to go through some of the highlights in it. The sewer system in Manistee was actually first constructed in the 1890s. It was decided in 1888 that they would build that sewer system as a combined system, which means it carried flows from all the houses and businesses, but it also took in all the stormwater. And back at the time, they thought that was a wonderful idea because it flushed the pipes out. When that system was built, it had direct discharges straight to the river, straight to Manistee Lake. There was no treatment. All it did was take the waste from your house and put it down to the river. In the 30s, about 40 years after that, the state, the world, the EPA started to recognize that that probably wasn't the safest thing to do. And so the first wastewater treatment plant with primary treatment was built along Manistee Lake. And then a series of pipelines were built along the water courses to intercept the flows that had previously been going to the river and the lake. The pipes and the treatment plant were not built with capacity to handle all of the stormwater flows, so they essentially were sized to handle the daily sanitary flows, and then overflows were placed in that system. These green dots indicate some of those locations. Overflows were placed in that system, so when it rained, when we had wet weather events, and the capacity of those pipes were exceeded, then the combined sewer overflowed into Manistee Lake and the river. Back in the early 70s, the city was under direction from the DEQ, as they were doing it to all the communities that had combined sewers. They were starting to push communities to separate their not necessarily separate their sewers, but to start eliminating the sewer separations. Some communities separated, like Manistee did. Some did built retention basins where they could store the water and then treat it over time, and many did combinations of those. In 1996, the city entered into a 20-year fixed date schedule to eliminate all the remaining combined sewer overflows. And the reason the city entered into that fixed date schedule is because it then gave the city eligibility to apply for low interest loans through the state revolving fund loan, or state revolving fund. In 2012, the last sewer district in the city was separated. However, in 2013, still 2 years ahead of when the final CSO needed to be eliminated, it was very evident that the treatment plant was receiving high flows during wet weather periods, both during snow melts and during storm events. So meetings started with the DEQ out of the Cadillac district, and we started discussing what options do we have, because there's no way that we can close that CSO without having negative impacts to our system. And we've had this in our capital improvement plan. You've seen it in there for years. Closing CSO, the final CSO, is only about a $50,000 project. It is literally taking an existing concrete wall and building it taller to the top of a chamber so that the sanitary sewer in that big vault is separated from the storm sewer. That's a very easy project. The problem is that it creates basement flooding, and I'll get to some of that in a little more detail in a minute here. When we went through the negotiations with the DEQ, there were several options. The state could issue a administrative consent order that said the city must do this stuff and it must do it by these dates. They could have renegotiated the NPDES permit to allow for extended time frames on that closure. That's originally what the city's position was. And what the state decided to do after lots of consultation with experts in Lansing and across the state was to handle it at an administrative level, because the city was not able to close that final CSO within the previous permit. They decided to not enforce action against the city because of it, because they understood the issue. They understand that the separation efforts had not succeeded to the level that had been hoped. and they were willing to take the next step with the city when the next permit was put in place. So in 2016, we negotiated the new NPDES permit. That gives us all our parameters for how we operate the plant and the system, the discharge levels, the testing requirements, but it also has specific sections that refer to our CSO, and it included a new program, which is the wet weather corrective action program. Incidentally, we asked for 2 more years than the state had offered us in that program, and after months and months of negotiation, we were only to get an extra 2 months out of them. They were very adamant that they kept this new plan within the extent of the 5-year permit. So we can come back and talk about the corrective action program in detail if you like, but essentially, like Sean has stated at the last meeting, and you heard a replay of that, what we need to do is further investigate where the inflow and infiltration is getting into the system. We need to develop a plan on how we're going to address it, either by construction projects to fix those inflow sources or a plan to be able to store those. We then need to go through, the state has to approve that plan makes sense. We have to go through a construction process to then implement those activities. And then there's a final process where we evaluate the system. What's the proper term?
Certify it.
We have to certify that the system is capable of functioning without the CSO in place and preventing any further disruptions. I believe we've given you copies of these sheets before. These are just the very detailed step-by-step portions of the corrective action program that Sean has referenced. So just kind of summarizing that, the city's has fully separated its sewer system. It's now classified as a separated system. We no longer have a combined sewer in the city of Manistee. In that 20-year period, that fixed date period, we eliminated 18 of the 19 CSOs, so we still have 1 remaining. Obviously, the new NPDES permit requires that closure. And closing that CSO today, like I started to talk about, has some potential issues, which essentially includes backing up basements and filling basements with sewage during storm events. We can have violations at the treatment plant for exceeding flow and treatment parameters there. And the biggest concern is if that plant has too much hydraulic capacity running through it, it can literally wash the treatment process out and lose our ability to treat for days and weeks. This is a map that we've shown you before. Spicer put it together. The orange buildings that are colored in are all the dwellings that for sure would have backups in it. It's a little hard to see, but I'm tracing a yellow line, which is what we call a hydraulic gradient line through the sewer system. So the treatment plant is right here. The CSO that we're talking about is right here. But when the flows at the plant exceed about 1.7 million gallons, we close a gate at the headworks that starts to back up the sewage through the whole plant. And so this whole area down in the eastern part of Manistee, where it would have the sewers surcharging, and obviously could cause the basement flooding.
Good news.
I talked a little bit about this last week, but just real quickly, so the corrective action plan that's in the NPDES permit and currently on file with the DEQ, that long list of all those steps, can kind of be broken down into a couple parts, 3 parts, and that really I'm looking at it from more of a funding standpoint. So the first part of the cap that we're actively doing right now, we've been working on it since the cap was imposed on us, is being done with funding from the SAW grant. So as I mentioned last week, a lot of this is condition assessment and inventory, evaluating just structurally how good the pipes and manholes are and what we need to do to fix them. It includes televising. We're finished with the sanitary sewer televising, and we are just finishing up the storm sewer televising. So that part in the SAW grant is done. And we have about 2/3 of the sanitary sewer televising completed. So there's a third of the city that still needs to be televised, to fully televise the full system. And that's what we're looking at under the, under a different, under the rural development or this revenue sharing bond. There's flow monitoring that's continuing to go on. We put in 12 flow monitors earlier in the SAW grant process. We've done hydraulic modeling on what we call the dry weather side, the normal flows, not the I&I. We have a GIS system put together. And then what we're ultimately doing with all this data is evaluating condition, evaluating its likelihood of failure of any pipe or manhole or pump station or a part of the plant. And we're weighing that against its risk. So there's certain parts of the system that are more risky. We'll weigh all that out so we can kind of rank projects. And we'll rank them based on their risk and impact to the system and how likely they are to fail. And then it ultimately will, be put into some form of a capital improvement plan. So that's on the SAW grant. That's ongoing as we speak. The other parts of the corrective action plan under phase 1 that are not in the SAW grant include some of these items. And these are the items that focus on inflow and infiltration. The SAW grant was not focused on that area. So we need to complete the remaining televising, which is approximately 18 miles. Actually, we think it may be a little less than that based on our latest calculations and looking at the data. We'll be doing what's called wet weather hydraulic modeling, actually simulating these CSOs and inflows into the system. We'll continue to flow monitor throughout the period. We're analyzing, we have been and we will analyze a lot of data at the treatment plant in terms of how much is I&I, how much is infiltration, looking at individual storms. In September, if we have funding in place, we would perform smoke testing throughout the city. Rural Water works with communities. They perform the smoke testing, and we would literally go around the whole city putting smoke into the pipes and then monitoring where that smoke comes out. And so if that smoke comes out of a roof lead or out of a gutter, that's obviously a connection in the sanitary sewer system that has stormwater coming in it. And so we would note that, we'd note where it is, and know that we have to go back and address it. So that would be happening in September if we have funding in place. We're going to be looking at identifying leads, and that's literally going through all the sanitary sewer data and looking at every single pipe that's connected. And we're on the order of probably 10,000 pipes that are most likely connected into the sanitary sewer system. Only probably half of those, or even less than half, are actual, leads from homes. The rest, we have to figure out what are they, and where are they coming from. Probably the majority of them are bulkheaded and capped off, but we kind of have to confirm that so we know it's not a stormwater source. So that's a big part of what we have to go through, and that's kind of grinding through these videos and looking at them and then going out in the field and trying to chase them down. That's all part of phase 1. The end product of that is, as Jeff was talking and as I talked last week, we're going to determine a project that we'll present to the DEQ that says this is the most cost-effective way we believe we can eliminate CSO 18 without causing flooding of homes or impacting the wastewater treatment plant or impacting basically your NPDES permit, and that we have good clean water being discharged. So we'll deliver that to the DEQ, and that's scheduled for June of next year. So it's around the corner, and it's a key part of how we get through this whole CAP process. Phase 2, so phase 1 would be, that's what we're talking about with the general revenue bond. Phase 2 would be a project we'd be looking at through a rural development bond, most likely. And this is the actual work. This is the design, permitting, and construction of whatever that basis of design project is, between source elimination or storing it. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ed to talk about the bonding process.
So tonight you have in front of you an agenda item which is called a notice of intent resolution. Prior to bringing this forward, we had to determine how we were going to finance this corrective action plan. And it's looking at this point, that we'll probably be doing it in one phase, an early phase, and then probably phase 2 or 3 down the road. The first phase will likely be market rate revenue bonds. That will get us the funds that are necessary for Sean to complete the investigation so he can complete the basis of design. And then phase 2 and or 3 we would be going to USDA rural development in order to get the funding to actually construct whatever the solution is determined out of the phase 1. So the notice of intent resolution is in front of you tonight. All that does, as Bond Counsel Pat McGow said, is it's the very first step in the process, and it sets the 45-day referendum window. So if that's approved tonight, then we would publish the notice of intent resolution and wait to see if there was any petitions received. If a referendum was to occur, it would require a petition signed by 10% of the registered voters in the city of Manistee, which is just below 500. Those petitions would get turned in, they'd be evaluated to make sure they were valid. If they're not, then there's no referendum. If they are, then the earliest that could happen would be a May election, which is approximately 7 months from now. Actually more than that. If that were to happen, that would delay our project at least 7 months. And that would have some pretty negative repercussions. One would be that the city would be unable to meet our milestones in the capital corrective action plan. And that would likely result in permit violations because, as Sean mentioned, that corrective action plan is a condition of our discharge permit. Also, if that were to happen, we could have a potential administrative consent order from the DEQ, which would force the city to go ahead and make those improvements. If you're under an administrative consent order and the DEQ says you must do this, then there is no referendum and the city can issue bonds without any approval of the electorate. So that's what could happen if there was a referendum. If there was no referendum, then the city would go ahead and proceed with the financing. We'd be working with our financial advisor and our bond counsel and adopt a bond authorizing resolution. So that would be another action that council would have to take. And we'd prepare for the sale, which is things like the offering statement, getting the bonds rated by S&P, publishing a notice of sale on the bond buyer. And that could happen, the actual bond sale could occur as early as November. And as we mentioned, phase 1 is estimated to be 1.2 to 1.5 million, again, to fund the investigatory work that's needed to create the basis of design. This would maintain our milestones in the corrective action plan. I want to talk a little bit about the water and sewer debt service. Today, our debt service is about $1.43 million annually through fiscal year 2020. In fiscal year 2021, we have a huge drop-off by almost 50%, a little more than 50% of our bond debt. It's a reduction of $683,000 per year. And then in the next fiscal year 2022, we have another $136,000 reduction. Those reductions would likely support the worst case scenario of a 20 million plus bond debt issue if we had to issue that much without having to raise rates beyond the 3.5% that's built into our plan. So it's a very important point to note. Because of the way our debt is structured, even if we had to issue $20 million in debt based on what we know today, we wouldn't have to raise rates beyond what we had already planned for our 3.5% per year, according to the rate study. Now, there's a lot of assumptions built into that. One of them is that we can get USDA rural development financing for the bulk of that, and that's pretty key because that's a 40-year amortization. But I think that should be made known because I think when you take on that much debt, assuming you have to do that, people are concerned about rate increases, but it would have basically no rate increase beyond what we already have planned. There would have to be some gap financing if we had to take on that much debt in fiscal year 2019 and 2020, but we would have to kind of work through the details of that as more facts were known, but I think that's manageable. The one thing that this would do potentially is would delay funding our depreciation fully, which is what we were hoping to do, but we would eventually get there. One thing to keep in mind is, as Sean mentioned in several of his presentations, they really don't know the size of that basin yet. So if we took out $1.5 million bond debt to fund the investigation, that second phase of debt could be 20 million, it could be 5 million. We just don't know what that might be. And I guess the point for council to consider here is that we have built into our current rates capacity to handle that whole range. And I think that's a very positive place to be in. This chart just kind of demonstrates that. You can see in fiscal year 2021, we have that sharp drop off. And that gives us the capacity to absorb more debt to comply with the state requirements. And it's important to note that this isn't something that the city is wanting to do on its own. It's being forced on us by the state and ultimately from the EPA. And so it's something that we basically have to comply with. With that, I'll turn it back over to Jeff to kind of summarize where we've been. Or Sean, sorry.
I guess just really in closing, I think we've covered everything we're going to cover, but one of the things we were talking about this morning just in our staff meeting was low-hanging fruit has been picked. We have gone through the last 20-some years and got a lot of the easy stormwater out of the system. By separating sewers, that took care of a majority of it. We're literally down to what I did is I just looked at the last CSO we had and tried to get a handle on how much water is really going over that weir. And the last event was 2.3 inches of rain as measured at the treatment plant. And over the city's footprint, it generated about 160 million gallons of water. Of that, we did have, and we definitely want to get rid of it, and we don't like it, but we had 1.4 million gallons go over the CSO. So it's a little less than 1% of all the rainfall that fell made it through the system and went over that weir. The other 99% went either where it was supposed to, through the storm sewer to the rivers or the lake, or through the treatment plant. So getting that last 1% is hard, and the DEQ is not letting us off the hook. It'd be nice to say we're at 99%, but we're not getting let off the hook. So it's just kind of puts things in perspective. We're really looking for this last piece and that's why we have to kind of crawl through every pipe and all this video to try and pick where is it coming from. Another angle on this is I kind of always back calculate how much land would it take to generate the water that goes over, the excess water going over the weir. And it's somewhere it kind of bounces around because all these storms are different, but between 100 and 200 acres of land seems to be about roughly what's out there that's directly connected to our sanitary sewer that gets to the plant quickly. So we're looking for these 100 or 200 acres of land, which could be, a couple hundred different homes, or it could be one or two parking lots, and we could be, we could get a big chunk of it. So, and we just don't know where it is. And a lot of the easy stuff's been found. And we found a lot in the last year or two, and as soon as we find it, we eliminate it. I think we're seeing some good trends in our CSOs. They're kind of trending a little bit down, but we still have to find them, and that's really where we're at. So I think with that, we'll just open it up to questions.
We need a motion on the agenda item before we go into discussion.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
I have a motion by Councilmember Whitmore, second by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski. Now we can go into discussion.
I have a question. Looking at the capital improvement plans that we approved this year, I looked at the water and sewer, and what I'm coming up with in costs that we've set aside for capital improvement is not 25 million. It's more like 11 million. So how did we get from when we approved the budget at 11 million for capital improvements to 25 million? What did I miss, and where is it?
Well, as Ed pointed out, that's the bond, or the debt drops off in what, about 5 years? 2021. So in 2021. So the money that's available today is what we've included in that 5-year capital improvement plan. So we forecasted out what's available in the next 5 years each year, and we've included those water and sewer projects in those. When the debt drops off is when it opens up for more projects to happen after that.
I don't think I'm quite following you. I mean, you put aside 5 million in capital improvements for the basin already, and 5 million to seal the infiltration problem. So that's 10 million.
Well, we've put those
And
in the
some
capital improvement plan as a
Right.
placeholder, but that doesn't identify how those are being funded yet.
Okay, but if we're going to raise 25 million, and we only think that, I'm sorry, I thought the capital improvement plan meant this is what we estimate the cost to be for the basement, for the basin. This is what we estimate the cost to be for this other thing. So how do we get to 25 million?
Because we have to, in the capital improvement plan, we were anticipating what those future projects could be. And our hope is that when we go through the phase 1 of the CAP program, we identify those sources of inflow and infiltration and can get as much of those out. Every gallon that we take out of the system today is worth $5 in the construction of that basin. The other thing that we've anticipated is that the preliminary meetings that we've had with the USRDA representatives indicate that because of the current debt load that we have, it could make us eligible for grant money on part of that money or part of that project. So we're not banking on that 100%. That's why the notice of intent is made at such a large number, because it's taken our worst case scenario and the fact that there is no grant money available through that funding source, and we can't find some of the cheaper way of getting the I&I out of the system. So there's kind of the two extremes that are there. Sure.
It just sounds to me like we're asking for twice as much as we need, and that's where I'm confused, so
Maybe I can clarify, Councilmember Beaton. In the 2018-2023 capital improvement plan, under the item for the equalization basin, it's clearly marked. It says the ultimate cost of this facility is not known at this point. 5 million represents an estimate only. And we've had multiple presentations to council over the past couple of years that said, worst case scenarios is, millions of gallons that we have to store, and it could be a really, really big number. So the thing to keep in mind is this notice of intent, if you do it at a larger number, council, one, they have to approve whatever bonds are ultimately issued. That means that the staff can't do that on their own. It has to go back through council. But what that does is it gives the city the certainty that it needs, that it can proceed with doing the corrective action plan that the state is requiring us to do. Otherwise, if we only did this for 10 million and the project turns out we can't find the water that we need to get out of the system, and it turns out to be a $15 or $18 million project, then we've got to go back and issue another notice of intent and start that process all over again with a 45-day referendum period. So this gives council the maximum flexibility. It doesn't force them to issue any debt. They have another bite at that apple. And so in consultation with our financial advisor, with our bond counsel, and with an internal discussion, we thought this was the best way to proceed, because we are on a very, very tight timeline, and we don't have a lot of luxury of being able to do a second notice of intent and delay that process any more than it already has been.
So just for my clarification, I apparently am the only one that's confused about this. We're only going to, when we get right down to it, are we going to do another estimate? Or are we going to know exactly how much money we need for each bond?
Okay, the plan at this point, assuming that bonds can be issued, is to issue probably around a $1.5 million bond, the first phase 1. That'll get us money so that the engineers and Jeff can do the investigation work that they need to do to be able to design what the ultimate solution is going to be. And Sean can elaborate on this more, but the intent is by getting out a year from now and having done that investigation, they will have a basis of design and will have a lot better idea of what those costs are going to be for the final solution. Is that?
Just to add to it.
I guess I don't want to borrow 25 million and issue $25 million worth of bonds if we only need 15 million. And that's what I.
Yeah, and I don't think you're issuing that much. It's a notice of intent that it could be as much as that.
Right.
But probably more importantly is we just don't know. But June of 2018, the MDEQ is requiring us to give that answer. So by June of next year, we will answer your questions on what is the cost, what exactly are we putting in the ground, what does it look like. That has to be done. That's one of the urgencies of getting up here today is we're on a very short window to give those answers. And so I wish I could give them to you today, and we're getting ideas, but we're a long ways from actually knowing that final product, and there's quite a bit of work to be done to figure that out. But June of 2018, we will know for sure, probably before that. But
I guess I have one more question on this, and that is, at what point did we have a new estimate or decide that 25 million was the number? When did we know that number or have that before us?
That's just, from the staff's perspective, that's the worst case scenario based on the information that we have at hand without taking into consideration what new information we expect to gather based on that.
I understand that, but at what point was there a meeting that we decided this is our worst-case scenario, this is the number, this is the 25
I
million?
remember in one meeting, I don't know which one, we talked about with what we knew at that time, that the basin would be the size of a football field, 70 feet tall.
Holy crap.
With what we know now, when we're certain we're gonna find ways to minimize that size. So I can't remember if there was a dollar figure attached to that or not. I just remember that was the descriptive message to council was, with what we know right now, without any further investigation, the basin's gonna be that large. And I think that's where the $25 million came in.
But you don't know when, oh wait, we need to have some kind of funding for this. You don't know when that was brought to your attention, like,
Oh, we always knew that we couldn't do it with the resources we have at hand.
Well, nobody's arguing that.
Always gonna come back for bonds. And we've been working on what number to put in there. And as Ed said, we chose that 25 million to give us the maximum flexibility. Now, as it's been said tonight, we might come back based on further investigation and at that design say it's only gonna take $10 million because we found X, Y, Z. And so we've minimized the inflow or the infiltration to the point where we don't need a basin that's as big as a football field, 70 foot tall. So it's not gonna require much.
It's like when you
But it's
go
just,
get pre-approved for a house, you may get.
we don't have, basically, we don't have all the information that we
But
need
if
to
you
make
find a
that
house that's only
final informed decision. And that's what we need, that first initial allotment of the bond to finish off our investigation so we can come up with that basis of design.
Go ahead, Mary, you go ahead.
my concern in this is that we knew that there was a problem for years now. And with the bond, so the city is really hoping that there's no petition to delay this, correct?
The city is absolutely hoping that there's no petition, but this is the process that we have to go through. It's laid out in state statute.
Right, so, but my concern is that for me to represent the residents here, now we're hoping that they don't want to voice their opinion. That to me is wrong, and that why did we wait this long to have, that they don't have a voice now? That we're hoping that they don't voice their opinion.
Well, I think, I'm not sure that's how I would characterize that. They do have a voice and they can petition, but ultimately the state says the city of Manistee has to do this. We have to do it, and we have to pay for it, and there's no way to pay for it out of the current revenues of the system. We have to borrow money to do so. So it's not a situation where city administration or past city councils have led us down this road to where we are today. This is being forced upon us by the state, and the city has taken very stepwise actions to get to where we are, because without separating the districts up to the point that we're at, we wouldn't know how much water we ultimately have to take out. And so we've tried to leverage at every point different sources of funding, the best interest rates. This started even before I was working for the city with the previous city manager, or two city managers ago, Ben Byfoss. And so there's been a plan that's been laid out over time, and this is the culmination of that, and this is where we find ourselves.
I think what the concern is here is we've just seen an indication in the slideshow that if there is a referendum and it goes to the ballot, we're not going to be able to make the timetable. So the question is, why didn't we start this process earlier to allow a potential citizen voter voice in the process? Now we're basically saying, yeah, if you do a referendum, we're going to be cited and probably fined or shut down or have sanctions against us because we're not going to have time to complete the project by having to have an election.
Yeah, and I can't directly speak to the negotiations with the DEQ or the timing of the NPDES permit. And the citizens are always welcome to avail themselves of the referendum process that's in state statute. But the reality of the matter is, if we think we don't know what the cost of that is now, if we had started this 2 years ago, we certainly wouldn't know what the cost is. You can't really issue bonds until you have a rough idea of what the project is going to be. The presentation that I've got up on the screen was given back in June, and this is just an example. It shows $8 to $20 million. Price varies greatly depending on hydraulic analysis. I believe, but I can't say for sure, that there were presentations a year before that talked about the volume and magnitude of this. So this shouldn't be a surprise to any of our citizens. This has been discussed repeatedly over the last 10 years that this ultimately is where we're going to come down to. And
Never been discussed how it would be funded, though.
I respectfully disagree with that. It has been discussed. It's always known that it's going to be a bond issue. We don't have those types of revenues in the system. But I think what I want to point out, and I just want to reiterate that is, because previous councils and this council have very wisely adhered to consistent rate increases, so they're not huge rate increases and then you don't have one for 10 years and then you have to have a huge rate increase. They've done it annually. And because we commissioned a rate study to put the water and sewer utility on a sound financial footing, we'll be able to fund whatever project within reason happens without having to dramatically increase the rates. And that's a really good place to be in.
But that's going to be the expense of funding depreciation of the system, which was the intent of the rate increase to begin with.
Administration has always been very clear with council. You're correct on that. But there will be some depreciation that is funded. But we've been very clear with council that once this project has a better scope and scale, that is not going to be handled with the rate increases per se that are in the system. You're going to have to not fund that depreciation, but you won't have to raise rates more than what we had built into the plan. And so, yes, if you want to fund depreciation, you may have to tweak those up a little bit more to do that. But I guess I come back to the state is forcing us to do this. We're trying to find the best way to finance it, the most economical way to finance it. The second phase of this, when it happens, will likely be rural development, and there's a pretty good chance that some of that will be grant funding. We won't know that, but it's possible, if not probable. And so there's still some unknowns, but this, again, is the first step in the process. And in order to try to meet the deadlines that have been forced upon us by a permit, that's why we have it in front of you tonight.
And go ahead, Mark, you've been waiting.
I just remember when I first was elected in 13, we started, I think one of the first meeting was the SAW grant, and that was a precursor to all this, to televising, because we knew what we were up against with that last CSO. And we did talk about during that meeting, we did talk about the retention pond. Could be anywhere from the old Century Boat property to, Morton's Field.
Just with regard to the question on the schedule, just to put things in the time frame. So we had, we negotiated our permit the end of last year, and it was issued the beginning of this year. And the corrective action plan, the actual letter from the DEQ, I think was issued in April or May, saying your corrective action plan is approved and adopted. And so from that point on, we immediately went to rural development as a potential funding source. It was our first place we looked, and we spent a month or two discussing that with them, and their timeframes are a lot longer. And so for them to get monies available, they'd be well into next year, which in itself would affect the schedule. So it hasn't been years since we've known the final of the corrective action plan. It was formally adopted, this spring by the DEQ, and from that point, we've been looking for funding sources, continuing to work on the SAW. We're using the SAW as kind of a workhorse to get some things done now, so we're not falling too far behind in other items. But it wasn't that long ago when we got approval on the NPDS permit, is the way to look at it. We didn't even know what our tasks were until January of this year. So, and then they formally adopted it with a letter, I think, I can look it up in March or April.
I certainly want to assure council there's no intent by staff to, keep citizens from exercising their will. If they want to take out a referendum, that's certainly that they have that ability to do it. We just wanted to point out that that is an option, and here's what the circumstances would look like if we went that way. That's all it is. And I'm comfortable that we brought this subject to council as quick as we can based on the information we had at hand.
Well, I agree with Mr. Whitlock. I've been coming to council for a long time. We've been talking about this for years. This is not a surprise. I do have a question for Sean, if you got a second. It seems like everything takes so long. Are you gonna be able to complete what you need to complete to come up with a dollar amount we're gonna need? Or do you have the time to do that, or are you gonna get halfway through and?
It's a very valid question. I think our key is we need to get started as soon as possible. One of the, I mentioned, and so the CAP's got this list of tasks. The SAW grant ones are moving, and those tasks, I think we're tracking very well with the DEQ's milestones and schedules. There are several items that aren't funded by the SAW that are kind of sitting idle. We're really not doing a lot on them. Those ones are starting to drift a little bit, and those ones are the ones I'm most nervous about. If we can get moving on this right away, we will do everything in our power to hit that June deadline and have a project. But just as an example, we've televised 25 miles of sanitary sewer. That's taken 2 years. We've been at it. You guys have seen the van around town. If you think about it, for 2 straight years we've been televising. And that's to get 25 miles done. We have another 15 to 18 to go, just to accommodate, that little piece of it. The scale is sometimes hard to comprehend. We drive around the roads every day, but there's as many or more pipes in the ground. And we have to go through with a little camera at 1 foot per second and look at all of them. And then we have to turn around and look at those afterwards. So it's...
I think it was mentioned that a gallon is $5. So every one that you can find, if you can only get halfway through, I mean, we're gonna have to build something that, yeah, it'd be nice if you got all the way through. Then we would know and we could fix it.
It would help, yeah, because it's all about, again, balancing the cost of preventing versus the cost of storing, and having televising data is a key component to that, in addition to our field work we have to do.
And that's one of the reasons that staff was lobbying very hard with DEQ for those additional 2 years on our permit, and we ended up with 2 months. Because we know that the timelines are extremely tough, and we're certain we're gonna come up with a much better project if we would've had 2 more years to look at it, but we don't have that opportunity. We'll come up with a solution, and we'll build what it's gonna take.
I have a question, Sean. I mean, if we cannot meet this timeline, what are the fines, or are there fines?
I don't know if there's necessarily fines, but there's going to be discussions and negotiations with the DEQ on how we manage it. You basically would be in violation of your permit, because it's written into the permit. Exactly what that would be, I'm not sure. I couldn't speak to that right now. I can tell you, when we put together the cap, I made a point of adding to the bottom of it the timelines for funding. I wrote in rural development, SRF, our own funds, general revenue bonds. I put that in there because there's this timeline involved, just like we're talking today with getting money. And the response from the DEQ was, Sean, just so you know, we're ignoring your last page. We don't care how you pay for it. You will meet these deadlines. We don't care how you're paying for it. We're glad you included it. We're glad you're thinking about it. But that's not part of your cap. It's just not part of it. It's not part of the schedule. They don't care how it's paid for, which makes it difficult.
I think the best answer we can give to that question is, if we're moving forward, if we're meeting those benchmarks, and we get to the end and we're not quite there, I would certainly hope that the DEQ would take that into consideration, that we have been working diligently, and maybe we're a couple of months away or whatever. I'd hope they take that into consideration, because it is a very, very tight timeline.
I do remember a presentation where they did talk about fines. They had the option of doing that, and the fines would fix a lot of pipe. I mean, they weren't cheap.
Right. And the DEQ does work with communities, but they start out, there's a lot of people that are very concerned about CSOs, so they're taking a very hard line on it. But if we got in that position, we would just have to start by talking with them and negotiating extensions. We just received one. We were supposed to be done in 2016. And there was just too much water going over that weir to allow that to happen. So we really have a 4-year extension we just received from the DEQ. And, so I don't know how long they'll keep, letting us do that. I wish we had more time, because the more time we have, the less we're going to store. We're going to find more, we're going to eliminate it, and it's less water we're paying to store. So.
Which costs a lot.
which storing costs more than fixing it at the source.
The city has put or invested a lot in taking care of the CSOs, and Jeff, do you remember the numbers?
22 million was the debt we issued for the separation work in that 20-year plan.
Plus other monies. So I mean, we've been working towards it, the city has been working towards it, this is just the final one that we have to deal with.
Now, you may have answered my question, but let me ask it a different way. With the remaining CSO, we can hit that timeline. We continue to dump into Manistee Lake. Are we gonna be fined after that 2021 date?
Potentially, yes.
Yeah, potentially, yes, absolutely, because you're in violation. I couldn't say for sure or how much. I think what Thad is saying is a very good point. We are showing due diligence in the process. And actually, when we met with the DEQ, it's one of the first things they say is, hey, first of all, we're not happy about the CSO. Second of all, we like everything you've been doing. You've been working at this for 20, 30 years, and you haven't let off the gas. I mean, we're up here looking for a revenue bond. They understand it's important to the city, and we're working towards it. So that hopefully helps us if we get in that position, but I couldn't say for sure.
The one thing I'll say is every time we meet with the DEQ and we ask them pointed questions like that, they will not give us a direct answer. What they say is, as long as you are working and meeting and showing progress and showing meaningful progress, but they always end it with, but if a third party steps in and objects to, it ties our hands. And so if they have a third party that objects to no action, then they have to take action, and that can absolutely be fines.
The other thing too is that I think the DEQ understands that if it comes to the situation of potential fines, if we're paying fines, we're not spending that money to fix a problem. And I would hope that the DEQ's priorities were to use our money to fix the problem.
I guess the last thing once that last CSO is corrected, we're not dumping into Manistee Lake, which dumps into Lake Michigan, so we're cleaning.
Yes.
Well, I had an opportunity to ride around in the truck that was filming. Compliments of Sean. He told me I could join and watch a filming session. And I did ask him about the water testing after all these CSOs. And apparently they've all been good. So, I mean, it is diluted sewage that's going into Manistee Lake, but the water tests have been good.
Yeah, and I asked that question of Sean directly today, and because we know we're able to tell how much inflow or infiltration is coming into the system, they're able to calculate now with all the data that they've already collected, and when it goes over the CSO, it's about 60% stormwater. And then it dumps into an actual storm sewer, a very large pipe that then flows probably a quarter mile to Manistee Lake, so it gets diluted again, and it's about 80% stormwater before it even hits the lake. And we have increased what our testing following a CSO event almost 100% more than what the state requires us to. So we test closer to that outfall, we test right upstream, right downstream of it, and we have not had a large hit. We did have one on the other side of the lake this summer, but I think it was an anomaly because the flows never get to that side of the lake. And we retested it the next day, and it came out fine. So we've never seen any impacts that way.
Have we had any complaints from business owners on Manistee Lake about the overflow?
None that's been brought to my attention.
Jeff?
Not that I'm aware of.
John? Okay.
Have we ever been in violation of the permits that we've been issued?
The last NPDS permit, we were technically in violation because it required us to submit a basis of design, construction drawings, and then complete the closure of CSO 18. So technically that was a violation, but the state did not issue a formal violation for that. They used what I termed as an administrative process where they put notes in the file and said it cannot be done because of these instances, and it will be rectified in the next permit, which is our current one.
SAW grant. I did, go back through the minutes and in researching things, back in December of 2015, the $1.9 million asset management program, a 3-year program, is that completed?
It's scheduled, the termination of that grant will be in October of 2018. So that'll be our 3rd year. And so we have to be done by next October. The reality is, I'm probably gonna have to be done this winter, Christmas, with the majority of that work because we need that data to do the next step. So, so we don't have to be done to next October, and there may be a few lingering things we do to kind of clean it up. But I think the bulk of it, all the field work is done now. Now we're into a lot of analysis, and we're gonna be coming back with a lot of maps about the condition of the system and where we should be focusing our money. And some of that depreciation will be, that's where a lot of that depreciation dollars you mentioned will be, and laid out in that SAW grant for the structural work.
We also, in April of 2016, in a council meeting with the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, did a resolution to explore the tribe accepting the overflow for processing. But has that gone anywhere? Has that dropped off the radar, or?
I don't know, yeah, go ahead.
There's been no further discussions. It's out there, and we have heard nothing back from the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians.
Because that could potentially be a more economical approach to things. I look at the history of this, and I understand it's extensive. I see we spent $40 million in the last 30 years to separate the extensively combined sewer system. But I also see some statements in some of the records that, to the best of everyone's knowledge, that regulators are removed or abandoned on all but CSO 18. And when someone tells me to the best of their knowledge, I'm thinking like, we don't know for sure. Is this the only outflow that we have for sure? Do we know that? I see other things in here where the majority of the sanitary sewer system is beyond its service life. And that's why I get concerned about funding depreciation and going forward. And another one that indicates that infiltration accounts for 40% of average daily flow. So if the system's picking up 40% of its flow from outside sources we're aware of, that's kind of alarming. We got 12 districts, and we've got 1 district that has the issue, District 7.
There's really 2 districts that are the main culprits of that.
But yeah, there's a couple we've got on the high hit list, but there's probably half of them that they're higher contributors. So, and that number is probably closer to 50%. Since then, we've been analyzing another year, 2 years worth of data, and probably about half the flows going to the plant are not wastewater.
If I can continue with that and then go back to one of your previous questions, after the resolution was passed to explore the tribal issue or option, the engineers went back and looked at, now we have a lot of inflow into the system, and that's coming in through cracked pipes, through groundwater. It gets worse when we have the high water levels like we have now. But the real issue that causes the CSOs is the spike flows. It's when we have a heavy rain event and there's a big charge of water that goes into the system, and that's that's the inflow portion of it. So we looked at what our CSO volumes are when they peak, and you either have to build a basin to store it and then pump it someplace else, or you have to have massive pumps, and I thought there were 24, 36, 30-inch lines. You got to be able to build a pump station that's large enough with massive pipes to be able to handle that peak and then pipe it someplace, and then that place has got to be able to store it. So from our perspective, we didn't think that there was any less expensive option locally, and then like Thad said, we haven't had any further discussions on it.
There's a question that comes to mind as I read through this. Are we considered in this process a combined or a separate sewer system? Because I saw some language that said, even though we are complete declared ourselves complete in sewer separation 2011, 2012, were classed as a combined system. Then what impact does that have on this resolution?
Well, and that's correct. Even though the construction of the separation was completed in 2012, the state didn't officially consider our system separated until the issuance of the current NPDES permit on January 1st of 2017. At that point, they classified us as a separated system, and it changes some of the rules and some of the ways that we proceed forward.
Okay.
I-
Smoke testing. The slides indicate we did smoke testing and dye testing in 2011 and 2014. Is it going to be any more effective? I mean, we paid for it once, now we're going to do it again. What's this going to show us?
I don't know if you came up with a better analogy than I did, but our experience is that when you've got, and I used the analogy of if you've got a garbage bag with 1,000 holes in it and you fill it full of smoke and you try to identify where all the holes are at, even though you plug all those up, you may have missed some. So when you re-smoke that bag, now with only 100 holes, most of those holes show up and they're a lot more obvious. So each time you do it, there's a diminishing return on that investment, but it's still one of the most cost-effective ways of finding stuff. And I will point out that the dye testing, sometimes the internal plumbing in the house doesn't let the smoke out or in the business. And so the dye testing has been used as a follow-up. We did a lot of that in the downtown district and found a lot of the illicit connections. And the other thing that we're finding is that there's a lot of redevelopment that's going on, and as people are redoing buildings, we're making a very specific point of addressing and looking at how their systems are connected, and we're finding a lot of them that just have internal plumbing. When Sean talks about the low-hanging fruit are the catch basins. They're the big parking lots. A lot of what's left are houses, footing drains, yard drains, businesses with flat roofs that still tie in. And so those are very, very hard to diagnose.
So we'll smoke test the entire city again?
That's our plan,
Okay.
yes.
I have one more question. If we approve this notice of intent resolution, is that when the 45 days start? When do the 45 days start for the people to petition?
If the resolution is approved tonight, then Michelle will have to publish that in the paper, and it starts from the day it's published in the paper. So I'm assuming that would get in probably Friday, maybe Saturday.
And just for clarity, even though we published an intent for up to $25 million, each individual bond itself is going to have to be approved by City Council.
That is absolutely correct. This is simply the first step in the process. Any actual debt issuance has to come back in front of council.
And we're saying $25 million. I'm looking at, like, if I'm gonna go buy a house or start looking at houses, I get approved for $300,000. The house I buy is $140,000. I'm not gonna borrow $300,000. I'm gonna borrow
You're absolutely correct,
the base.
Councilmember Goodspeed. So when the investigatory work is done, and Sean comes up with a basis of design, and they do cost estimates, and they say, we think we can build the retention basin for $7 million, plus contingencies, plus whatever, so $8 million, then that's what we would issue the bonds for.
That's what
And-
kind of direction I thought.
But the 25 million, the reason that we have that number in there is that's kind of a worst-case scenario. And because of the tight timeline, it potentially prevents having to come back and do this again and, have several months of lost time when we really can't afford to do that.
Okay.
Are there any further questions? City Clerk, would you please take roll?
Councilmember Goodspeed,
Yes?
Councilmember Whitliff,
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac,
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper,
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski,
Yes.
and Mayor Smith.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. Consideration of designating a voting delegate for Michigan Municipal League annual meeting. Annual convention of the Michigan Municipal League will be held September 13 through 15, 2017. pursuant to the provisions of league bylaws, we are requested to designate by action of governing body, one official who will be in attendance at the convention as the official representative to cast votes for the city of Manistee at the annual meeting, and if possible, to designate one other official to serve as an alternate. Signed up to attend the convention are Mayor Smith, Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski, and City Manager Taylor. At this time, council could take action to appoint a voting delegate and an alternate to the Michigan Municipal League Annual Convention.
I'll make a motion.
Who are you motioning?
Huh?
You have to motion somebody.
Oh, that's right, sorry. That would be, Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski. Sorry. Glad you're my secretary.
I'll second it.
I have a motion to nominate Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski as the voting delegate. Is there any discussion? Would you please take roll?
Councilmember Woodliff,
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton,
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper,
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed,
Yes.
Councilmember Pontiac,
Yes.
Mayor Smith,
Yes.
and Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Approved.
And now a motion for an alternate.
I'll make a motion to appoint an alternate, City Manager Taylor.
I'll second it.
I have a motion by Councilmember Beaton, second by Councilmember Goodspeed to nominate City Manager Taylor as the alternate. Is there any discussion? Will you please take roll?
Councilmember Pontiac,
Yes.
Councilmember Woodliff,
Yes.
Mayor Smith,
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed,
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski.
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton,
Yes.
Councilmember Cooper.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Thank you. Consideration of a Freedom of Information appeal, Tom Rhoda. Tom Rhoda submitted a Freedom of Information request to the city for police incident records involving Manistee residents Geneva Schwab and/or her ex-husband Bruce Schwab since 2014. The city provided some records, and after consulting with the Manistee County Prosecuting Office on August 15, 2017, denied the request as to reports relating to the incident that took place on August 8, 2017. The basis indicated for the denial was that the records are exempt from disclosure under the Michigan Freedom of Information Act, as they constitute investigative records compiled for law enforcement purposes, and disclosure would interfere with law enforcement proceedings, in part as the disclosure could reveal direction of the investigation, alert potential witnesses, and disclose facts before completion of witness interviews, all of which may negatively affect the ability of law enforcement to gather reliable information. Further, disclosure could jeopardize both the prosecution and defense rights to a fair trial. Mr. Rhoda has indicated his decision to appeal the denial, indicating first appeal of this Freedom of Information Act response as pertains to the incident report generated on 8/8/17 concerning the killing of Bruce Schwab, and all other partially or non-exempt public records supplementing this report since then, citing effectively the same rationale he used for appealing the total denial of records concerning the killing of Lee Pat Milks on April 7th. The last appeal of Mr. Rhoda was factually different and involved a lengthy statement by Mr. Rhoda that is unrelated to the records requested in the current Freedom of Information Act request. The previous statement from the last appeal is contained in Mr. Rhoda's email of April 7, 2017. At this time, council could take action to deny the appeal of Mr. Rhoda, grant appeal, or grant the appeal as to some of the records and deny as to others.
I'll make the motion to deny.
Second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Whitliff and a second by Councilmember Cooper to deny the appeal. Is there any discussion? Would you please take roll?
Councilmember Cooper?
Yes.
Councilmember Beaton?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Yep.
Mayor Smith?
Yes.
Councilmember Whitliff?
Yes.
And Councilmember Pontiac?
Yes.
Approved.
Thank you. Consideration of Manistee County Homeward Bound Animal Shelter Annual Stretcher Mutt Event. Manistee County Homeward Bound Animal Shelter would like to hold their annual Stretcher Mutt event on Sunday, September 17th, 2017. They plan to start at the Lions Pavilion, walk to and down the Riverwalk as far as the House of Flavors and back to the Lions Pavilion. The time for this event is from noon to 4 p.m., with the walk occurring between 1 and 3 p.m. At this time, council could take action to authorize the Manistee County Homeward Bound Animal Shelter Stretcher Mutt event on Sunday, September 17, 2017, subject to the appropriate department approvals.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
Wait a second.
I second.
I have a motion by Councilmember Beaton, a second by Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski. Is there any discussion?
I believe we're kind of double dipping here with all the noise about allowing dogs on the Riverwalk, and we potentially could approve this. I think we're going down the wrong path.
At first, I would agree with that,
Okay.
but it's a special event. Just like on River Street, we have booze in the brats, and you're allowed to walk down River Street with beer in your hand or alcohol, or in a assigned area, and we allow that as a special event. It doesn't change our ordinances, it just changes for that event. And so that's why I disagree with your statement on that one alone. That's,
Okay.
I agree with Mark, though. I think they could find a better place to do their strut their mutt. They could do it on First Street or River Street. I don't think they have to do it on the Riverwalk. Because everybody that sees it, that's got a dog, figures after that's over, that they can take their dog down there and do it what they want down there.
like I said, this is a special event.
I think when we do special events downtown and have street closures, I don't know how some people handled their alcohol sales, but I know there were locations that still had barriers up and restricted people with alcohol to the area where it was sold. I'm not aware that people were free.
No, I'm not saying they didn't say walk down, but they were still in that area. You can't have with a routine.
You know,
So
I think we have to have some flexibility on this. I understand what we're saying about the Riverwalk and not allowing the dogs on the Riverwalk. And I don't think this really deviates from our policy. This is a very popular event. I have participated in this. It's very well publicized. It's one of their biggest fundraisers. It is something that they really need to use to generate money. It's always been very well managed. The dogs have a great time because there's a socialization period before the walk starts. They're all going in the same direction. I've not seen any big problems between the dogs. This is entirely different than walking down the Riverwalk and then having a surprise turn in the bend and meeting a dog, where we have our fears about having dogs on the Riverwalk to begin with. And the publicity we get from this is overwhelming. Lots of people like to come and watch it. I think it's a good thing for our city. I would hate to say no to this.
And part of the reason why we went more aggressive on keeping the dogs off the Riverwalk is because of the waste and not having responsible pen owners. These are responsible pen owners. I mean, they're gonna make sure, I believe that.
It's always been a cleanup. Everybody's been really good about it.
So I don't have a problem with this, so that's my opinion.
I understand the intent of the fundraiser, but then I would fall back, as Councilmember Cooper indicated, in would the fundraising be any less effective coming down First Street and then coming down River Street to the House of Flavors and back, as opposed to the Riverwalk? I'm conflicted with the idea that we've got a rule that we expect to be enforced, And I get a lot of feedback from people that are opposed to dogs on the Riverwalk, and then we make exceptions to those rules. And again, people see that dogs are on there, and they see that there was an exception, and they continue with the practice.
It's really hard to miss all of these dogs. They're all traveling together. They're all wearing bandanas. It's really hard not to think anything but it being a special event. I guess I would disagree with you, Jim, on that.
Wouldn't they get more visibility down River Street or First Street? And, I mean, who's gonna see them on the Riverwalk?
Well, I think the intent of the Riverwalk, well, I know what the intent was. I was on the Animal Shelter Board for quite a while. The intent was that they couldn't walk dogs on the Riverwalk, so it was a draw, and people had an opportunity to walk their dogs on the Riverwalk. I'm not necessarily sure that's true today. I think you see a lot of dogs on the Riverwalk. But anyway, that was the intent, that it was something special, something you didn't ordinarily get to do.
I appreciate the Homeward Bound Shelter. I mean, they do wonderful things, but I just think this is the wrong area to take your dog. That's my
I
feelings.
think they do
So-
come back on the street after they hit
And
House
the
of Flavors.
visibility, you get more visibility on First Street, River Street, Water Street, so, just my thoughts.
Any further discussion or comment?
So every time we cross a side street, then we have to stop, wait for traffic, that kind of.
I would think that it's put on the Riverwalk too for the safety of the animals as well. There's no traffic there. There's no thing to really scare them. I would have to agree with Goodspeed on this. You know, we do special occasions for everything else. This wouldn't be any different.
I think we need to work on ordinances or have some consideration when we write ordinances, that if we want to give exceptions, that we write it into the ordinance. If we want it to be a little looser, sometimes our ordinances are really hard, fast, and I'm kind of toe the line guy. If it says don't do this, I don't do this. I don't vary from that. So I'm sure they've been planning for this. I'm sure it's been past practice, and I'm in favor of it. So.
Any further discussion or comments? City Clerk, please take roll.
Councilmember Cooper?
No.
Councilmember Beaton?
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Zelinski?
Yes.
Councilmember Goodspeed?
Yes.
Councilmember Whitliff?
No.
Councilmember Pontiac?
Yes.
And Mayor Smith?
No.
Motion approved.
Thank you. Citizen comment. This is an opportunity for citizens to comment on the municipal services, activities, or areas of city involvement. Citizens in attendance shall be recognized by the mayor for comment, limited to 5 minutes. Letters submitted to council will not be read. Are there any citizens that wish to make comment?
Gary Patulski, 159 Quincy Street. You know, if there was ever a meeting that should have been videotaped, this should have been the one, with an issue as large as we talked about, $25 million potential bond issuance. I don't think that the questions that Councilman Beaton and Pontiac asked was that difficult. When was the first time $25 million was ever discussed? Never got an answer. Tells me that we don't have minutes being taken by these meetings, and that's not a difficult question. And also not a difficult question as to when Aaron pointed out that if this is petitioned by the citizens, you have no time to react to get this plan together. The city had no alternative plan in place to know how to come up with $1 million to $1.5 million to complete the investigation stage. Pretty sad. But yet, during the same 20-year period, we know where we had money to go, right? Subsidies, 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 with no thought in place, hey, we need money for other things. Sad, sad event. And I think you council members did a great job tonight asking questions, but I think it would have been great to have the citizens see the dysfunctional nature of our city administration that we have. It is sad. Thank you.
Mayor, City Manager, isn't it recorded?
Yeah,
Being recorded.
It is being recorded.
But not videotaped, right? Or is it being videotaped?
Yes.
Videotaped.
Thank you. Okay.
Okay. Are there any other citizen comments? Yes, sir.
Probably too late, with them dogs on the Riverwalk. I was here when they passed that ordinance, and purposely, they passed that ordinance, they didn't want dogs on the Riverwalk, because some of those dogs are rescue dogs, some of them were abused. Now, I don't care if they have a leash or not, you don't have enough room. On a sidewalk, you can walk out on the road or go around them. On a Riverwalk, you're stuck. I know dogs that don't like guys with hats on, and what if they're walking a dog by you and there's a woman with a little kid there, and all of a sudden he reaches out to pet that dog? What's that dog gonna do? A lot of them are afraid of fast movements. What are you gonna do then? Who's gonna carry the liability insurance if somebody gets their leg half tore off from one of them big dogs? I wouldn't have passed that. I like dogs, but there's a place for them, and it's not on there. You're too confined of a quarters.
Okay. Thank you. Are there any other citizen comments? If not, officials and staff, city manager,
Nothing.
city attorney, city clerk,
Your Honor.
finance. Public safety still here?
No.
City engineer? Public works?
Nothing, Your Honor.
Got no planning and zoning? Council members? Council member?
Nothing.
Nothing?
Nothing.
Have a great Labor Day weekend.
Nothing.
Nothing. I want to thank all the people in attendance for this special meeting. I think it was necessary to discuss the bond issue, but I appreciate the attendance after we failed to have a quorum for last week. But thanks to everybody.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Adjourn.